The morning mist clung to the Pine Ridge civilian training facility like a shroud, softening the sharp edges of military precision that defined every corner of the compound. At 0600 hours, while most of the world was still asleep, Cassandra Cass Whitmore pulled her beaten Honda Civic into the gravel parking lot, the engine's rough idle cutting through the silence. At 32, Cass had the kind of understated presence that made people forget she was in the room. Brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, gray eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing, and a slender frame that moved. With an economy of motion most people mistook for timidity. She'd come to Pine Ridge 6 months ago with a simple goal: secure the medical assistant position and disappear into the background. The facility was a strange hybrid, part corporate training center, part boot camp revival. It attracted mostly men, many of them combat veterans trying to transition into civilian security work or police training. They carried themselves with the swagger of people who'd seen real action, and they had little patience for what they perceived as weakness. "Morning, Ghost," called out Marcus Thompson, a former Army sergeant who'd appointed himself the unofficial welcoming committee. His greeting carried the particular brand of mockery that men like him reserved for women who didn't fit their narrow definition of toughness. Cass nodded once and kept walking. She'd earned the nickname Ghost Nurse within her first week, not for any supernatural qualities, but for her ability to appear whenever someone needed medical attention, handle the situation with quiet efficiency, and disappear before anyone could properly thank her. The training facility's medical bay was her sanctuary. Here, among the neat rows of bandages, antiseptic, and emergency equipment, she could work without the constant weight of judgment. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she inventoried supplies, checked expiration dates, and reorganized instruments that had been carelessly tossed aside by yesterday's training session. "Whitmore!" The voice boomed across the bay, making several recruits jump. Sergeant Rodriguez, the head instructor, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. At 55, he carried himself like a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't solve with volume and intimidation. His gray mustache twitched when he was particularly pleased with himself, which happened frequently. "Yes, Sergeant?" Cass responded, not looking up from her work. "Need you to clean the practice rifles again. Some of these boys couldn't hit the broadside of a barn if it was painted with a target, and they're blaming their equipment." His laugh was harsh. "Maybe your delicate touch will make them feel better about their incompetence." The comment drew snickers from the recruits who'd gathered in the doorway. Cass had learned that Rodriguez's teaching style relied heavily on humiliation as motivation. She was a convenient target, quiet, competent, and seemingly unbothered by his constant stream of condescension. "Of course, Sergeant." She set down the inventory clipboard and moved toward the weapons storage area. "And Whitmore?" Rodriguez's voice carried a particularly nasty edge. "Try not to break anything. I know how you medical types get all nervous around real weapons." More laughter followed her as she walked away. What they didn't see was the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, or how her fingers briefly traced the worn military watch on her wrist, a gesture so subtle it might have been unconscious. The rifle maintenance area was a converted storage room filled with cleaning supplies, gun oil, and the distinctive smell of metal and solvent. Cass had requested this space be set aside for proper weapons care after witnessing several recruits attempt to clean their rifles with whatever random supplies they could find. Rodriguez had agreed, but only after making it clear that she was responsible for maintaining every weapon in the facility. As she worked, methodically disassembling and cleaning each rifle with movements that were almost mechanical in their precision, Cass found herself thinking about the photograph hidden in her locker. Her father, Major Jack Phantom Whitmore, in his dress blues, his eyes sharp and focused in a way that made the camera seem inadequate to capture his intensity. He'd been legendary in sniper circles, the kind of soldier whose exploits were whispered about in mess halls and training facilities around the world. But to Cass, he'd been something more important. A teacher who'd shown her that true strength didn't need to announce itself. "It's not about the shot, Cassie," his voice echoed in her memory. "It's about everything that comes before the shot. The preparation, the patience, the perfect moment when everything aligns." The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, surrounded by men who worshipped at the altar of military prowess, and none of them had any idea who she really was. They saw a quiet medical assistant who jumped at loud noises and flinched when they raised their voices. They had no idea she'd been trained by one of the most feared marksmen in modern military history. "Hey, Ghost!" Cass looked up to see Danny Morrison, one of the newer recruits, standing in the doorway. Unlike the others, Danny was young, maybe 22, and hadn't yet learned to hide his kindness behind a mask of manufactured toughness. "You okay in here? Heard Rodriguez giving you grief again." "I'm fine, Danny. Thank you for asking. You sure?" "Because some of us have been talking, and we think he's being pretty unfair to you. You do more work around here than half the instructors." Cass felt something warm flicker in her chest, a recognition that not everyone here was intent on making her life miserable. "I appreciate that, but I can handle Sergeant Rodriguez." Danny nodded, though he looked unconvinced. "Well, if you ever need someone to back you up, you've got friends here. Maybe not all of us, but some of us." After he left, Cass continued her work with renewed focus. The rifles were old but well-maintained, and she found herself automatically checking for things the average user would never notice: slight variations in the trigger pull, microscopic scratches on the barrel that might affect accuracy, the precise tension of the scope mounts. Her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that came from thousands of hours of practice. Every movement was economical, purposeful, and completely at odds with the nervous, uncertain persona she projected during the day. As the afternoon wore on, the familiar sounds of the facility continued around her: the sharp crack of rifle fire from the range, the shouted instructions of various trainers, the heavy footsteps of men moving through the corridors with the unconscious swagger of people who'd never learned to walk quietly. But in the maintenance room, surrounded by the tools of her trade, Cass allowed herself a moment of stillness. She thought about her father's lessons, about the promise she'd made to herself after his death, and about the careful balance she'd been maintaining for the past 3 years. She'd sworn never to pick up a rifle again, but she hadn't sworn to forget everything he taught her. The skills were still there, dormant but intact, waiting for the right moment to emerge. What she didn't know was that moment was coming sooner than she expected. The morning started like any other, but Cass could sense the tension in the air before she even reached the medical bay. Voices carried across the compound, not the usual mix of instruction and casual conversation, but something sharper, more urgent. She found Danny Morrison sitting on one of the examination tables, his face pale and his left arm cradled against his chest. Blood had soaked through his training shirt, and his eyes held the particular glassy quality that came with shock and blood loss. What happened? Cass moved immediately into action, her hands already reaching for gloves and antiseptic. "Rifle malfunction during target practice," Danny said through gritted teeth. "The bolt mechanism jammed, and when I tried to clear it, something went wrong. The rifle kicked back hard, and the scope housing caught me right in the shoulder." Cass examined the wound with professional efficiency. It was deeper than a typical training accident should have been. The edges were clean, suggesting the metal had been sharp, but there was something about the injury pattern that made her pause. "Danny, show me exactly how you were holding the rifle when this happened." He demonstrated the position, and immediately Cass saw the problem. The scope mount was loose, not slightly loose, but dangerously loose. No properly maintained weapon should have had that kind of play in such a critical component. When was the last time this rifle was serviced? She asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. I don't know. We just grab whatever's available from the rack. Cass felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd been maintaining these weapons for 6 months, and she knew for certain that every scope mount had been properly secured. Someone had deliberately loosened this one. Working quickly, she cleaned and dressed Danny's wound, her mind racing through the implications. The injury could have been much worse if the rifle had been aimed differently, if Danny had been standing at a different angle. They could have been looking at a serious head injury or worse. You need to see a doctor, she told him. This needs stitches, and you might have some muscle damage. Can't you do it? I heard you're pretty good with this stuff. I'm good, but I'm not a doctor. This is beyond first aid. She helped him to his feet. I'll drive you to the emergency room myself. As they walked toward the parking lot, Sergeant Rodriguez appeared in their path, his face flushed with the kind of anger that came from having his authority questioned. Where do you think you're going, Morrison? Sir, I need medical attention. Ms. Whitmore is driving me to... Like hell, she is. Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that veteran soldiers recognized as a prelude to an explosion. You signed up for this training program, which means you follow my schedule, not hers. You can see a doctor after training hours. Cass felt her control slip slightly. Sergeant, with respect, this injury needs immediate attention. If there's muscle damage, did I ask for your medical opinion, Whitmore? Rodriguez's voice cracked like a whip. You're a medical assistant, not a doctor. Your job is to put band-aids on scraped knees and make sure the first aid kit is stocked. Sir, I've seen enough injuries to know. You've seen enough injuries? Rodriguez's laugh was ugly. Lady, you've been playing nurse for 6 months in a training facility. Don't mistake that for real medical experience. The small crowd that had begun to gather watched in uncomfortable silence. Cass could see Danny's condition deteriorating. His pallor was getting worse, and she could tell he was fighting nausea. Sergeant Rodriguez, I understand your position, but this recruit needs medical care that I can't provide here. I'm not questioning your authority. I'm simply stating a medical fact. You're not stating anything, because you don't have the qualifications to state anything. You're an assistant. You assist. You don't make decisions. Cass felt the familiar weight of her father's watch against her wrist. She thought about all the lessons he taught her about choosing battles, about the difference between retreat and strategic patience. I understand, Sergeant, but I'm asking you, as someone who cares about the welfare of your trainees, to please let me take Danny to get proper medical care. Rodriguez stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath. When he spoke, his voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. Let me make something very clear, Whitmore. You are not a doctor. You are not a nurse. You are not a medic. You are a civilian employee whose job is to keep the first aid supplies organized and maybe slap a bandage on someone if they get a paper cut. You do not make medical decisions. You do not diagnose injuries, and you certainly don't tell me how to run my facility. The silence that followed was deafening. Cass could feel the eyes of every person in the compound on her, waiting to see how she would respond to such a public humiliation. She looked at Danny, whose condition was clearly worsening, then back at Rodriguez. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried a steel that made several of the watching recruits straighten unconsciously. I understand your position, Sergeant, but I'm taking Danny to the hospital now. You can write me up, suspend me, or fire me if you want, but I'm not going to stand here and watch someone suffer because of bureaucratic pride. Rodriguez's face went red. If you walk out of here now, don't bother coming back. Cass helped Danny toward her car, her hand steady on his good arm. "I understand, Sergeant." As they drove away, Danny looked at her with something approaching awe. "I can't believe you just did that. You basically told Rodriguez to go to hell." "I told him I was taking you to get medical care. Nothing more, nothing less. But you could lose your job over this." Cass was quiet for a moment, her hands steady on the steering wheel. "Danny, my father taught me something a long time ago. He said that sometimes the most important battles aren't about winning or losing. They're about deciding who you want to be when the moment comes to choose." At the hospital, Danny received 12 stitches and a prescription for antibiotics. The doctor confirmed what Cass had suspected. Without proper treatment, the injury could have led to serious complications. "You saved my ass," Danny said as they sat in the waiting room. "I mean that literally. That could have been a lot worse. I'm just glad you're okay. What are you going to do now?" "About Rodriguez, I mean." Cass was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet, but I think it's time I stopped being invisible." As they drove back to the facility, Cass made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to quit, and she wasn't going to continue accepting Rodriguez's abuse. She was going to fight back, but she was going to do it smart. Her father had taught her that the most dangerous opponent was the one you underestimated. Rodriguez had been underestimating her for 6 months. It was time to show him what a real mistake looked like. Cass arrived at Pine Ridge the next morning to find her access card deactivated and a note taped to her locker. "Report to Sergeant Rodriguez immediately upon arrival." The medical bay had been locked, and she could see through the window that someone had rifled through her carefully organized supplies. She found Rodriguez in his office, sitting behind his desk with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd won a decisive victory. Colonel Thomas Ellis, the facility director, sat in the chair across from him, his weathered face carefully neutral. "Whitmore." Rodriguez didn't look up from his paperwork. "I've been reviewing your personnel file. Seems there are some ... discrepancies." Cass remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back in a position that would have been familiar to anyone who'd served under her father. "What kind of discrepancies, Sergeant?" "Well, for starters, your emergency contact information lists a deceased individual. That's a violation of facility policy. My father died 3 years ago. I can update the form to reflect. Then there's the matter of your medical training credentials. You've been acting beyond your scope of practice, making diagnoses, recommending treatment. That's not just a policy violation, it's potentially illegal." Colonel Ellis shifted in his chair, his expression growing more troubled. "Sergeant Rodriguez, what exactly are you alleging?" "I'm alleging that Ms. Whitmore has been misrepresenting her qualifications and endangering the safety of our trainees. Yesterday's incident with Morrison is just the latest example." Cass felt her temper flare, but kept her voice level. "Sergeant, I provided basic first aid to an injured recruit and ensured he received proper medical care. How is that endangering his safety? You overstepped your authority, made medical decisions you're not qualified to make, and undermined the chain of command." Rodriguez finally looked up, his eyes cold. "I've initiated disciplinary proceedings. You're suspended pending a full investigation. On what grounds?" "Insubordination, practicing medicine without a license, and violation of facility safety protocols." He slid a document across the desk. "Your suspension is effective immediately." Cass read the document carefully, her mind automatically cataloging the charges and noting the careful legal language. Rodriguez had been too busy, in fact. This level of documentation didn't happen overnight. "Colonel Ellis," she said, looking directly at the facility director, "I'd like to request a formal hearing regarding these charges." Ellis nodded slowly. "That's your right, Ms. Whitmore. I'll schedule it for next week. Actually, sir, I'd like to invoke the facility's emergency review protocol. According to the handbook, If an employee believes they're being retaliated against for reporting a safety violation, they can request an immediate review. Rodriguez's confident expression faltered slightly. What safety violation? Cass reached into her bag and pulled out a small plastic bag containing the scope mount from Danny's rifle. This component was deliberately loosened, Sergeant. I removed it from the weapon after the accident. It's been tampered with. The room fell silent. Ellis leaned forward, his experience as a combat officer suddenly evident in his sharp attention to detail. Explain. I maintain all the weapons in this facility, Colonel. I personally checked and secured every scope mount 3 days ago. This level of looseness doesn't happen through normal use. It requires deliberate action. She set the bag on the desk. I think someone wanted to create an accident. Rodriguez's face was flushed with anger. That's a serious accusation, Whitmore. Are you suggesting that someone on my staff? I'm not suggesting anything, Sergeant. I'm presenting evidence and requesting a proper investigation. Ellis picked up the bag, examining the component with the eye of someone who'd handled military equipment for decades. This does look like deliberate tampering. Even if that's true, Rodriguez said, his voice rising, it doesn't change the fact that Whitmore exceeded her authority. She's not qualified to make that kind of determination. Cass looked at him steadily. Actually, Sergeant, I am. You're a medical assistant with basic first aid training. I'm a medical assistant with basic first aid training. Cass agreed. But I'm also a former Army medic with 6 years of active duty experience, including 2 combat deployments. I have advanced trauma certification, weapons maintenance certification, and I've seen more real injuries in one tour than most people see in a lifetime. The silence in the room was deafening. Rodriguez stared at her as if she'd grown a second head. You never mentioned military service, Ellis said quietly. I wasn't required to. My civilian qualifications were sufficient for the position. Cass met his gaze steadily. But since my qualifications are being questioned, I thought it might be relevant to mention that I've been maintaining weapons and treating combat injuries since I was 22 years old. Rodriguez found his voice. If you have military experience, why didn't you apply for an instructor position? Why take a job as a medical assistant? Because, Sergeant, I didn't want to spend my days yelling at people and making them feel small. I wanted to help them learn and grow. Her voice carried the faintest edge of steel. I believe there's a difference between leadership and intimidation. Ellis stood up, his decision-making process clearly engaged. Ms. Whitmore, I'm going to ask you to wait outside while I speak with Sergeant Rodriguez privately. Cass nodded and left the office, but she could hear the raised voices through the door. Rodriguez was clearly unhappy with this new development, and Ellis was asking pointed questions about the weapons maintenance protocols and safety procedures. 20 minutes later, Ellis emerged alone. Ms. Whitmore, I'm suspending your suspension, pending a full investigation. You'll be back to full duties tomorrow, but I want a complete report on your findings regarding the weapons tampering. Yes, sir. And Ms. Whitmore, next time you have concerns about safety, I want you to bring them directly to me. Is that understood? Understood, Colonel. As she walked back to her car, Cass allowed herself a small smile. She'd played the first card in her hand, and it had been more effective than she'd hoped. Rodriguez had underestimated her completely, assuming she was just another civilian who could be bullied into submission. But revealing her military background was just the beginning. She had other cards to play, and she was beginning to realize that this fight was about more than just her job or her dignity. It was about something her father had taught her long ago. Sometimes you have to stand up not just for yourself, but for everyone who can't stand up for themselves. Rodriguez had been terrorizing trainees and staff for years, hiding behind his rank and position. But Cass had spent her entire childhood learning from one of the most patient, methodical warriors in military history. The sergeant wanted a war. He was about to discover what it felt like to fight someone who'd been trained by a legend. Cass returned to work the next morning to find the atmosphere at Pine Ridge had shifted dramatically. Word of her confrontation with Rodriguez had spread through the facility like wildfire, and for the first time in months, she found herself the center of attention, though not all of it was positive. "I heard you were in the Army," said Jessica Parker, one of the few other women at the facility. She worked in administration and had always been cordial but distant. "Is it true you served in combat zones?" "I did." Cass continued organizing the medical supplies that had been scattered. "During yesterday's search, 2 deployments, Afghanistan and Iraq. Why didn't you ever say anything? Most of the guys here won't shut up about their service records." Cass paused in her work. "Because I didn't come here to talk about the past. I came here to do a job." But Jessica's question made her realize something important. She'd been so focused on staying invisible that she'd missed opportunities to connect with people who might have been allies all along. Her father had always emphasized the importance of intelligence gathering understanding, not just your enemy, but your environment and your potential resources. Over the next few days, Cass began to pay closer attention to the dynamics at Pine Ridge. She noticed that Rodriguez's intimidation tactics weren't limited to her. He regularly humiliated trainees, especially the younger ones, who reminded him of his own insecurities. She observed that several of the older instructors seemed uncomfortable with his methods, but were reluctant to challenge him directly. Most importantly, she began to document everything. "Danny," she said during one of their brief conversations, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Sure. What is it?" "Has Rodriguez ever done anything that made you feel unsafe during training? Not just uncomfortable, actually unsafe?" Danny's expression grew serious. "You mean like the rifle thing? That or anything else?" Danny looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "There was this one time, about a month ago. We were doing defensive driving exercises, and Rodriguez made Marcus Thompson take the course, even though Marcus had told him he was having dizzy spells from some medication he was taking. What happened? Marcus crashed into one of the barriers. Could have been really bad, but he got lucky. Rodriguez just laughed it off, said Marcus needed to toughen up." Cass felt her jaw tighten. "Did anyone report it? Who would we report it to?" "Rodriguez runs everything around here." "Not everything," Cass said quietly. "Colonel Ellis outranks him." "Yeah, but Ellis is only here like once a week. Rodriguez makes sure he's on his best behavior whenever the colonel's around." That evening, Cass sat in her small apartment surrounded by papers and her laptop. She'd been researching facility policies, safety regulations, and the chain of command structure at Pine Ridge. What she'd discovered was troubling, but not surprising. Rodriguez had been carefully operating in the gaps-creating situations that were dangerous, but not obviously illegal, intimidating people who were unlikely to complain, and maintaining a facade of competence whenever higher-ranking officials were present. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated her, and in doing so, he'd given her access to information she never would have had otherwise. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Jake Hamilton, instructor at Pine Ridge. Can we meet? I have something you need to see." Jake Hamilton was one of the older instructors, a former Marine who'd been at Pine Ridge for almost 3 years. He had a reputation for being fair but tough, and unlike Rodriguez, he didn't seem to take pleasure in humiliating people. They met at a coffee shop 20 minutes from the facility. Jake looked nervous, constantly, glancing around as if he expected Rodriguez to appear at any moment. "I heard about what happened with you and Rodriguez," he said without preamble. "I also heard you used to be in the Army." "That's right. Look, I don't know you very well, but I've been watching you work for months. You're good at what you do, and you actually care about the people here. That's more than I can say for some people. Jake slid a manila folder across the table. Rodriguez has been keeping a file on you since your second week. I saw it when I was in his office last month. He's been documenting every conversation, every interaction, every time you so much as sneeze wrong. Cass opened the folder and felt her blood run cold. Page after page of detailed notes, photos taken without her knowledge, and what appeared to be a systematic plan to build a case for her termination. Why would he do this? Because you made him nervous from day one. You're competent. You don't. Kiss his ass, and the recruits respect you. In Rodriguez's mind, that makes you a threat. Cass studied the documents more carefully. Jake, how did you get this? I made copies. I've been keeping my own files on Rodriguez for about a year now. Why? Jake's expression darkened. Because I've seen what he does to people who cross him. Last year, there was a guy named Peter Williams, good instructor, former Navy. He questioned one of Rodriguez's training methods, and within a month, Rodriguez had him fired for performance issues. Completely destroyed his reputation in the industry. What kind of performance issues? Made up ones. But Rodriguez documented everything so thoroughly that Williams couldn't fight it. He's working security at a shopping mall now. Cass felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you think Rodriguez is capable of sabotaging equipment to make someone look incompetent? Jake's silence was answer enough. I need more than suspicion, Cass continued. I need proof. I might be able to help with that. Rodriguez keeps detailed logs of equipment maintenance, but I've noticed discrepancies between what he reports and what actually gets done. What kind of discrepancies? Weapons that are supposedly serviced but show no signs of recent maintenance. Safety checks that are logged as complete but obviously haven't been performed. Small things, but they add up. Cass closed the folder and looked at Jake directly. Why are you helping me? Because I'm tired of watching good people get destroyed by someone who's more interested in protecting his ego than doing his job. And because I have a daughter about your age, and I want someone to stand up for her if she were in your position. As they prepared to leave, Jake had one final piece of advice. Be careful, Cass. Rodriguez has been playing this game for a long time, and he's good at it. Don't underestimate him. Cass nodded, but she was thinking about something her father had once told her. The best hunters are patient, Cassie. They study their prey, they understand their environment, and they wait for the perfect moment to take their shot. Rodriguez had been hunting her for months, but now she was hunting him back, and she had something he didn't, the training and patience of someone who'd learned from the best. The war was about to begin, but it wouldn't be fought on Rodriguez's terms. It would be fought on hers. The opportunity Cass had been waiting for arrived 3 weeks later in the form of a surprise inspection. Colonel Ellis announced that a team from the State Regulatory Commission would be conducting a comprehensive safety review of the facility, including equipment maintenance, training protocols, and staff qualifications. Rodriguez's reaction was immediate and telling. Within hours of the announcement, he was frantically trying to address months of neglected maintenance and documentation. Cass watched from her position in the medical bay as he barked orders at instructors, demanded immediate equipment inspections, and generally created the kind of chaos that revealed just how unprepared they were for legitimate oversight. Whitmore, Rodriguez's voice carried across the facility. I need a complete inventory of all medical supplies and equipment. Have it on my desk by end of day. Of course, Sergeant. Cass had been expecting this request. In fact, she'd been preparing for it for weeks. What Rodriguez didn't know was that Cass had been meticulously documenting every aspect of the facility's operations since their confrontation. She had photographs of improperly maintained equipment, records of safety violations, and detailed notes on every incident that had been swept under the rug or inadequately addressed. But more importantly, she had been quietly building relationships with people throughout the facility. Danny Morrison had introduced her to other recruits who had stories about Rodriguez's dangerous training methods. Jake Hamilton had provided her with access to maintenance records that showed a pattern of falsified reports. Even Jessica Parker had begun sharing information about administrative irregularities she'd noticed but been afraid to report. Cass. Danny approached her workstation with a concerned expression. "I heard about the inspection. Is Rodriguez going to try to blame you for the problems they find?" "Probably, but I'm ready for that." "What do you mean?" Cass looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then pulled out a thick binder. "I mean, I've been documenting everything. Every safety violation, every incident that wasn't properly reported, every piece of equipment that wasn't maintained according to regulations." Danny's eyes widened. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since the day he suspended me. I realized that if I was going to survive here, I needed to be prepared for anything." "This is incredible. You've got photos, maintenance records, incident reports, double quotes, and witness statements. Jake Hamilton has been helping me, and several other people have agreed to provide testimony if needed." Danny flipped through the pages, his expression growing more serious. "Cass, this isn't just about your job anymore. This is about the safety of everyone here." "I know. That's why I'm not going to let Rodriguez turn this inspection into another opportunity to intimidate people." That afternoon, Cass received a call from Colonel Ellis requesting a private meeting. She found him in his office, looking more serious than she'd ever seen him. "Ms. Whitmore, I want to discuss the upcoming inspection. I've been reviewing our procedures and protocols, and I'm concerned about some potential issues." "What kind of issues, Colonel?" "Equipment maintenance, safety, protocols, incident reporting. I'm getting the impression that there may be some gaps in our procedures." Cass chose her words carefully. "Colonel, I think there are some things you should know about the facility's operations." "Such as?" "I've been documenting safety concerns for several weeks. I wasn't sure who to bring them to, but given the inspection, I think you should see them." She handed him a folder containing photocopies of the most serious violations she'd documented. Ellis reviewed them in silence, his expression growing darker with each page. "Miss Whitmore, these are serious allegations. Equipment tampering, falsified maintenance records, safety violations, double quotes." "Yes, sir." "I have documentation and witness statements for everything in that folder." Ellis looked at her directly. "Why didn't you bring this to me sooner?" "With respect, Colonel, you're only here 1 day a week. And I was told that the chain of command required me to go through Sergeant Rodriguez first. Not for safety issues. Never for safety issues." Ellis closed the folder. "I want you to know that this information will be provided to the inspection team. They'll want to interview you directly." "I understand, sir." "Ms. Whitmore, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Are you doing this because of your personal conflict with Sergeant Rodriguez?" Cass had been expecting this question. "Colonel, I won't lie to you. Rodriguez and I have had our differences. But I'm not doing this because of personal animosity. I'm doing it because people could get seriously hurt if these problems aren't addressed." Ellis nodded slowly. "I believe you. But you should know that Rodriguez has also submitted a formal complaint about your conduct. He's alleging that you've been undermining his authority and creating a hostile work environment." "I see. The inspection team will investigate his allegations as well as yours. I want you to be prepared for that." "I am, sir." As Cass left Ellis's office, she felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She'd played her hand, and there was no going back. Now, but she'd learned something important from her father's military stories. Sometimes, the best strategy was to let your enemy defeat themselves. Rodriguez had been so focused on trying to destroy her that he'd neglected the very responsibilities that made his position secure. He'd falsified records, ignored safety protocols, and created a culture of fear and intimidation. Now, with proper oversight coming, all of those chickens were coming home to roost. That evening, as she prepared for what would likely be the most important week of her career, Cass thought about her father's words. The most dangerous enemy is the one who underestimates you, Cassie. But the most satisfying victory is the one where you never have to fire a shot. Rodriguez had been hunting her for months, but he'd made a crucial error. He'd assumed she was prey. He was about to discover that she was actually the predator. The State Regulatory Commission arrived at Pine Ridge at exactly 0800 hours on a gray Monday morning. The inspection team consisted of 3 people. Dr. Angela Martinez, a former Army colonel who specialized in training facility safety, Robert Chin, a weapons maintenance expert, and Linda Stevens, an administrative compliance officer. Rodriguez had spent the weekend in a frenzy of last-minute preparations, barking orders at staff and trying to address months of neglected maintenance. But Cass could see the cracks in his facade from the moment the inspectors arrived. "Welcome to Pine Ridge," Rodriguez said, his smile too wide and his handshake too firm. "I'm Sergeant Rodriguez, head instructor. We're excited to show you our world-class training facility." Dr. Martinez, a compact woman with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd commanded respect in much more dangerous places than Pine Ridge, looked around the facility with the practiced eye of a professional. "Thank you, Sergeant. We'll be conducting a comprehensive review over the next 3 days. We'll need access to all areas, all personnel, and all documentation. Of course, whatever you need." The first day proceeded smoothly from Rodriguez's perspective. The inspectors toured the main training areas, reviewed basic safety protocols, and conducted preliminary interviews with staff. Rodriguez stayed close to the team, offering explanations and deflecting questions with the skill of someone who'd been managing inspections for years. But Cass noticed things Rodriguez didn't. She saw Dr. Martinez pause at the weapons storage area, running her finger along surfaces that should have been spotless, but showed traces of dust and oil residue. She watched Robert Chun examine rifle maintenance logs with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what to look for. Most importantly, she observed Linda Stevens taking detailed notes about everything she saw and heard. On the second day, the inspection team began individual interviews with staff members. Jake Hamilton was called in first, followed by several other instructors. When Cass's turn came, she found herself sitting across from all 3 inspectors in Colonel Ellis's conference room. "Ms. Whitmore," Dr. Martinez began, "we understand you've raised some concerns about safety protocols at this facility." "Yes, ma'am, I have. Can you walk us through your specific concerns?" For the next hour, Cass methodically presented her documentation. She showed them photographs of improperly maintained equipment, maintenance logs that didn't match actual conditions, and records of incidents that had been inadequately investigated or reported. Robert Chun leaned forward when she presented the scope mount from Danny's rifle. "You removed this yourself?" "Yes, sir. After the accident, I wanted to understand what had caused the malfunction." "And you determined it had been deliberately loosened?" "In my professional opinion, yes. The pattern of wear and the looseness of the component were inconsistent with normal use or gradual failure." Dr. Martinez studied the photographs Cass had taken. "These images show multiple weapons with similar maintenance issues." "Yes, ma'am. I've been conducting my own inspections because I was concerned about the safety of the trainees." Linda Stevens had been taking notes throughout the interview. "Ms. Whitmore, are you aware that Sergeant Rodriguez has filed complaints about your conduct?" "I am, ma'am. Ma'am, he alleges that you've been insubordinate, that you've exceeded your authority, and that you've been undermining his leadership. How do you respond to those allegations? Cass had been preparing for this question for weeks. Ma'am, I believe that ensuring the safety of personnel is everyone's responsibility, regardless of rank or position. When I've expressed concerns about safety, I've done so through appropriate channels and in accordance with facility policies. But you did disobey a direct order when you took Mr. Morrison to the hospital? Yes, ma'am, I did. I made a decision that medical care was more important than following the chain of command in that specific situation. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. In your military experience, Ms. Whitmore, how would you characterize the leadership style at this facility? Ma'am, I believe there's a difference between discipline and intimidation. Effective leadership creates an environment where people feel safe to report problems and ask questions. Ineffective leadership creates an environment where people are afraid to speak up, even when safety is at risk. The interview concluded with the inspectors asking for copies of all her documentation. As Cass left the conference room, she saw Rodriguez waiting in the hallway, his face flushed with barely controlled anger. Enjoy your little chat, Whitmore? I answered their questions honestly, Sergeant. I'm sure you did. Too bad honesty won't save your job when they realize you've been making up stories to cover your own incompetence. But Cass could see something in Rodriguez's eyes that hadn't been there before. Genuine worry. For the first time since she'd arrived at Pine Ridge, he was no longer certain he was in control of the situation. The third day of the inspection focused on technical evaluations. The team conducted detailed examinations of weapons, safety equipment, and training protocols. Cass watched from a distance as Robert Chun discovered multiple rifles with improperly secured scope mounts, exactly as she had documented. She also watched Dr. Martinez interview several trainees privately, including Danny Morrison. When Danny emerged from his interview, he looked shaken but relieved. They asked me about the rifle accident, he told Cass quietly. I told them everything, about the loose scope, about Rodriguez telling me I couldn't go to the hospital, about how you stood up to him. How did they react? Dr. Martinez asked me if I felt safe during training here. I told her the truth, that I felt safe when you were around, but nervous when Rodriguez was running things. That afternoon, Colonel Ellis called an emergency staff meeting. The inspection team had completed their initial assessment and wanted to present their preliminary findings. Dr. Martinez stood at the front of the room, her expression grave. We've identified several significant safety violations and procedural irregularities at this facility. These issues pose serious risks to personnel and could result in the suspension of your operating license. The room fell silent. Rodriguez's face had gone pale. However, Dr. Martinez continued, we've also identified personnel who have been working diligently to address these problems and maintain safety standards despite systemic failures in oversight and leadership. She looked directly at Cass. Ms. Whitmore, your documentation and proactive approach to safety compliance likely prevented more serious incidents. We're recommending that you be commended for your diligence and professionalism. Rodriguez started to speak, but Dr. Martinez held up her hand. Sergeant Rodriguez, we'll be conducting a final interview with you tomorrow morning. We have serious concerns about the leadership and safety culture at this facility, and we'll need detailed explanations for the violations we've documented. As the meeting broke up, Cass felt a mixture of vindication and apprehension. She'd proven her case, but she knew Rodriguez wouldn't go down without a fight. The final confrontation was still to come. That evening, Jake Hamilton approached her with a grin on his face. I heard what happened in the meeting. Rodriguez looked like someone had told him his pension was being canceled. It's not over yet, Cass replied. He still has one more interview. Maybe, but I think you've already won. The inspection team knows exactly what's been going on here, and they know who's been trying to fix it. Cass nodded, but her father's voice echoed in her memory. Never celebrate until the mission is complete, Cassie. That's when people make their worst mistakes. The final confrontation was coming, and she needed to be ready for anything. The fourth day of the inspection dawned clear and cold, and Cass arrived at Pine Ridge to find Rodriguez pacing outside the administration building. Like a caged animal, his usual swagger had been replaced by the desperate energy of a man who could feel his world collapsing around him. The inspection team had scheduled his final interview for 0900 hours. At 0830, he cornered Cass in the parking lot. "This is all your fault," he hissed, stepping close enough that she could smell the stale coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "You think you're so smart, running to the inspectors with your little stories and your fake documentation. The documentation isn't fake, Sergeant. It's all verifiable. We'll see about that. When this is over, when they realize you've been lying about everything, I'm going to make sure you never work in this industry again. I have friends in every training facility in 3 states." Cass looked at him steadily, noting the slight tremor in his hands and the way his eyes darted around the parking lot. "Sergeant, I think you have bigger problems to worry about than my career prospects." Rodriguez's face flushed red. "You think you've won? You think because you have some military experience and a few pieces of paper that you can come in here and destroy what I've built? I didn't destroy anything, Sergeant. You did that yourself. I'd been running training programs since before you graduated high school. I've trained thousands of people, saved lives, made careers. You're nobody. A failed medic who couldn't hack it in the real military." The insult hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Cass felt her father's training take over. Her stance shifted almost imperceptibly, her weight balanced, her hands ready. Rodriguez had just crossed a line he didn't even know existed. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried a steel that made Rodriguez unconsciously step back. "Sergeant, you don't know anything about my military service, and you don't know anything about why I left. But I'll tell you what I do know. I know that in the past 6 months, 3 people have been injured because of equipment you were responsible for maintaining. I know that you falsified safety reports and ignore protocols that exist to protect people. And I know that you've spent more time trying to intimidate and humiliate your staff than you have actually doing your job." Rodriguez opened his mouth to respond, but Cass continued. "Most importantly, I know that when the inspection team asks you to explain the discrepancies in your maintenance logs, and the pattern of safety violations and the multiple complaints about your leadership style, you're not going to have good answers. Because the truth is, you've been coasting on your rank and your reputation for years, and you've forgotten what real leadership actually looks like. You don't know what real leadership looks like. You've never commanded anything." "You're right, Sergeant. I never commanded a training facility. But I served under commanders who earned respect through competence and integrity, not fear and intimidation. And I learned from a man who understood that true strength comes from protecting people, not dominating them." Rodriguez's face was now purple with rage. "Your father, right? The big war hero you keep talking about? Let me tell you something, being related to someone doesn't make you special." Cass felt something cold and dangerous settle in her chest. "You're absolutely right, Sergeant. Being related to someone doesn't make you special, but being trained by someone does. And everything I learned from my father, patience, precision, the ability to wait for exactly the right moment, that's all mine." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that you've spent 6 months trying to destroy me, and instead, you've destroyed yourself. Every time you falsified a report, every time you ignored a safety violation, every time you intimidated someone into staying, quiet about a problem. I was watching. I was documenting. I was building a case that even you couldn't argue your way out of. Rodriguez stared at her, and for the first time, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. You set me up. No, Sergeant. You set yourself up. I just made sure there was a record of it. Before Rodriguez could respond, Colonel Ellis appeared in the doorway of the administration building. Sergeant Rodriguez, the inspection team is ready for you. As Rodriguez walked toward the building, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Cass felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Jake Hamilton standing behind her, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. I heard most of that, he said. Quietly, remind me never to get on your bad side. I don't have a bad side, Jake. I just have a very good memory and a lot of patience. The final interview lasted 3 hours. Through the windows of the conference room, Cass could see Rodriguez gesticulating wildly, Dr. Martinez taking notes with the methodical precision of someone documenting a disaster, and Linda Stevens occasionally shaking her head in what appeared to be disbelief. When it was over, Rodriguez emerged from the building and walked directly to his car without looking at anyone. His face was the color of ash, and his hands were shaking as he fumbled with his keys. 15 minutes later, Colonel Ellis called another staff meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice heavy with the weight of command decisions. Effective immediately, Sergeant Rodriguez has been relieved of his duties pending a full investigation by the State Regulatory Commission. I will be assuming direct oversight of training operations until a replacement can be found. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present. I want to be clear about something. The safety violations and procedural irregularities identified by the inspection team are serious and unacceptable. We will be implementing immediate changes to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. His gaze settled on Cass. Ms. Bastille. Whitmore, I'd like to speak with you privately after this meeting. When the room had cleared, Ellis gestured for Cass to take a seat across from his desk. The inspection team has recommended that you be promoted to Chief of Safety Operations, he said without preamble. It's a newly created position that will give you oversight of all safety protocols, equipment maintenance, and incident reporting. Cass was quiet for a moment, processing the unexpected offer. Colonel, I appreciate the recognition, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for that level of responsibility. The inspection team disagrees. Dr. Martinez specifically recommended you for the position. She said, and I quote, Ms. Whitmore demonstrated exactly the kind of professional integrity and attention to detail that this facility needs to rebuild its safety culture. I see. There's something else. Ellis opened the folder on his desk. The investigation into Rodriguez revealed something interesting. It turns out you weren't his first target. Over the past 3 years, he systematically drove away 7 qualified instructors and safety personnel through intimidation and false documentation. Cass felt a chill run down her spine. 7 people? 7 people who tried to report safety concerns or challenge his methods. All of them were eventually forced out through manufactured performance issues or disciplinary actions. Ellis looked at her directly. You're the first person who fought back effectively. I had help. Jake Hamilton, Danny Morrison, several others provided information and support. Yes, but you were the one who had the courage to stand up to him when it mattered. And you were smart enough to do it the right way. As Cass left the meeting, she thought about the path that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd come to Pine Ridge hoping to disappear into the background, to find a quiet place where she could use her skills without having to confront the ghosts of her military past. Instead, she'd found herself in a war she never wanted to fight against an enemy who had vastly underestimated her capabilities. But as her father had always taught her, Sometimes the most important battles weren't about what you wanted. They were about what was right. 3 months later, Cass stood in the same conference room where Rodriguez had once tried to humiliate her. But everything had changed. The walls now displayed new safety protocols, updated training schedules, and a prominent board listing incident. Reports and their resolutions. Transparency had replaced secrecy, and accountability had replaced intimidation. The new rifle maintenance protocol is working well, reported Jake Hamilton, who had been promoted to senior instructor. We haven't had a single equipment malfunction in 6 weeks. Good, Cass replied, making notes in her tablet. What about the anonymous reporting system? We've received 12 reports so far, all of them legitimate safety concerns. People feel comfortable speaking up now. Dr. Martinez had returned for a follow-up inspection the week before and had given Pine Ridge a clean bill of health. More importantly, she complimented the facility on its remarkable transformation in safety culture. Ms. Whitmore, she'd said during her exit interview, I've been conducting inspections for 15 years, and I've never seen such a complete turnaround in such a short time. You've created something special here. But for Cass, the real measure of success wasn't in the inspection reports or the improved statistics. It was in the faces of the trainees and staff who no longer flinched when they asked questions or reported problems. It was in the confidence of people like Danny Morrison, who had been promoted to assistant instructor and was thriving in an environment where learning was valued over intimidation. Cass, Danny approached her after the meeting. I wanted to thank you again for everything you did. Not just for me, but for all of us. You don't need to thank me, Danny. You would have done the same thing. I don't think I would have had the courage or the skills to pull it off. Cass smiled. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid. And as for skills, sometimes life prepares you for battles you never expected to fight. That evening, Cass sat in her office reviewing incident reports when Colonel Ellis knocked on her door. Got a minute? Of course, Colonel. Ellis took a seat across from her desk, his expression serious but not troubled. I just got off the phone with the State Regulatory Commission. They've completed their investigation into Rodriguez. And he's been permanently barred from working in any training or educational facility in the state. They also forwarded their findings to the federal authorities, who are investigating potential violations of workplace safety laws. Cass nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor sympathy. Justice had been served, but it hadn't been her goal. Safety had been her goal. There's something else, Ellis continued. I received a call from General Patricia Hayes at Fort Benning. She's heard about what happened here, and she wants to offer you a position developing safety protocols for military training facilities. That's quite an honor. It is. She specifically mentioned that your combination of medical expertise, weapons knowledge, and leadership skills is exactly what they need. Ellis paused. She also mentioned that she served with your father. Cass felt her heart skip slightly. She knew him? Apparently, they worked together on developing sniper training protocols in the late 90s. She said he always talked about his daughter and how proud he was of her service. For a moment, Cass was transported back to her childhood, sitting on the front porch with her father as he cleaned his rifle and told her stories about the importance of precision, patience, and protecting others. What did you tell her? I told her I'd pass along the offer, but that I hoped you'd stay here. We still have a lot of work to do, and frankly, I can't imagine trying to do it without you. Cass looked around her office at the safety protocols she'd developed, the incident reports that were now being properly investigated, the photographs of staff and trainees who were thriving in an environment built on respect rather than fear. I appreciate the offer, Colonel, but I think I'm exactly where I need to be. That night, Cass drove to the small cemetery outside town where her father was buried. She knelt beside his headstone, pulling a few weeds that had grown around the base of the granite marker. "I understand now, Dad," she said quietly. "When you taught me about patience and precision, about waiting for the right moment, you weren't just teaching me about shooting. You were teaching me about life." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, she could almost hear his voice. "I'm proud of you, Cassie. You kept your promise." As she drove back toward town, Cass thought about the journey that had brought her here. She'd come to Pine Ridge trying to escape her past, trying to hide from the skills and knowledge that connected her to painful memories. Instead, she discovered that those skills, the patience, the precision, the ability to see what others missed, weren't burdens to be hidden. They were gifts to be used in service of something larger than herself. The next morning, she arrived at Pine Ridge to find a new group of trainees beginning their program. They were young, nervous, and eager to prove themselves, just like she had been once, just like everyone was when they started something new. "Welcome to Pine Ridge," she told them during their orientation. "Over the next several weeks, you're going to learn skills that could save your life or someone else's life. But more importantly, you're going to learn that real strength comes not from intimidating others, but from lifting them up. Not from hiding your weaknesses, but from using your strengths to protect those who need protection." One of the trainees, a young woman who reminded Cass of herself at that age, raised her hand. "Ma'am, what if we're not strong enough? What if we don't have what it takes?" Cass smiled, thinking of her father's words in the long journey that had brought her to this moment. "Then you'll learn. Because the most important thing I can teach you is this. You're stronger than you know, more capable than you believe. And when the moment comes to stand up for what's right, you'll find that you've been prepared for it your entire life." As the trainees headed off to their first training session, Cass stood in the doorway of the facility, watching them with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found her true calling. She'd never picked up a rifle again, just as she'd promised herself. But she'd used every lesson her father had taught her to create something that would have made him proud. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought with weapons. Sometimes they were fought with patience, integrity, and the courage to stand up when others couldn't. And sometimes the quiet ones, the ones everyone underestimated, turned out to be exactly the warriors the world needed most. The end. If you've ever found strength you didn't know you had when someone needed protection. If you've ever stood up for what's right, even when it felt impossible. Or if you've ever discovered that your greatest trials prepared you for your most important moments, then you understand that heroes don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they simply show up, do what needs to be done, and make the world a little bit safer for everyone else. True strength whispers. It doesn't need to shout. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.